Hello, I'm George Liston, CA, and welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. We live in a world in which the need for cross-cultural communication is implicit in everything from the design of foreign policy to the search for harmony in our own neighborhoods. The challenge is difficult. Recognizing the world of significance in a different culture means understanding that even the similar may embody difference. But the effort is essential, particularly given our need to better understand and communicate with Islamic culture. For history and destiny have conspired to make us neighbors on a very small planet. We must seize the creative possibility of building ties even as we recognize difference. My guest is Lawrence Rosen, William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Anthropology at Princeton University and a current fellow of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Larry Rosen, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
Larry, this is a great topic. It's and one of the great issues of our time. And as I said in the introduction, it goes from the neighborhood level up to the level of international affairs. I'd like to begin at the neighborhood level.
Yes, exactly. After 35 or 40 years of working in the Arab world itself, I found a lot of it came home literally to my block when a man from the Middle East was having some difficulties with his understanding of American law and the expectations of his neighbors. He was creating a bit of a nuisance on the block. And the more we tried to talk with him, wow, I think some of my neighbors were sympathetic but didn't quite understand where he was coming from. Perhaps I understood a little too well where he might be coming from and therefore thought I understood him. When he would say, for example, well, you know, the law is just for the rich people. And I would protest, wonderful American that I am, no, it treats everybody equally. It's something that everyone has to obey. He would talk about how people of different sorts had different levels of influence.
Yeah.
And increasingly, I found that there was a need, I believe, on his part for the kinds of relationships that he expected from the world that he came from that were very different from those of ours, and that contributed to the misunderstanding.
And let's explore that, his sense of the need for those relationships. First of all, as I understand it, Larry, it was your block.
Yes.
And this gentleman, as he opens the junkyard, he sees it as a beneficence. In fact, he sees it, and I quote here, as a real service to everybody.
Yes.
Now, not everyone obviously saw it that way.
Not since he was keeping it open 24 hours a day and creating a bit of a nuisance.
Right. But in his mind, if I understand this correctly, Larry, it was an open space that he had put something on that could be of use to everyone and established a sense, the possibility of there being some kind of community brought up around that.
And a key phrase that he kept using was, he said, I want to be your very good neighbor. Now, neighbors in the Arab world mean something rather more than they do here. There's a saying, better your neighbor who is close than your kinsman who is far away. You're very interdependent with the people who are your neighbors. And it's a world, if I can generalize, in which people have to build up networks of obligation to one another. Think, if you wish, as a kind of electrical system. It's the pluses and minuses that make the thing hold together. If you pull the plug and it's all pluses or all minuses, nothing holds together. So there's a constant process of offering hospitality, of ingratiation, of being one up on the other guy, of being able to convert something that's an obligation in one domain, like economic, into something else, like marital. I think to a certain extent he expected us to be incorporating this web of indebtedness. Someone said there, in debt there is relationship.
Well, precisely, in a sense, to negotiate a sense of interdependence among all of you.
That's right.
As opposed to our notion, very American notion perhaps, of separateness. That is, we are neighbors, but you live in your house, I live in mine. And
even more than that, a rather different conception perhaps about what people are like, what the self is like. We, for example, think there's no difficulty, and I don't mean this in any superior or inferior sense, that there's no difficulty in playing one role with part of yourself and a different one at another time. For example, I often repeat to people several decisions by American Supreme Court justices involving the death penalty, in which they said, I'm personally opposed to it, but as a justice of the Supreme Court, I must go along with it. And people will always say to me, who is this guy? Where's he from? Who's he connected to? What incidents have occurred to him in his life? To them, the idea that you can fractionate the self is not particularly meaningful. Rather, you are a unity of the traits and ties that you possess the interrelations you possess, where we will say, for example, who am I? I'm the guy who owns this Rolex watch. I'm the one who owns that Lexus sedan. I'm the person who fashions himself. I'm the person who may even fashion my own moral self. That would be almost incomprehensible to people from much of the Middle East who think that you can't fashion those things or separate those things.
Should I, in that sense, Larry, would one think of himself or herself as a product of his or her connections in the Middle East as opposed to his or her Rolex watch?
Yes, and while that is something that I think many Americans can look at and say, well, yeah, we do that too. It's as though we diverge by about 5 degrees. And the further along you get, the farther away you get, and you're a sailor, you know if you're off by 5 degrees far enough, you're going to hit a rock.
That's true.
A misunderstanding.
This is a marvelous example, Larry, of a phrase that you have used, and I've actually taken on myself, and that is being aware of the differences that might lie in similarity. I mean, it could be embodied. We think we know it, but we really don't, because it's just slightly different.
And all the different pieces of a culture being connected to one another, some things may strike one as kind of odd until you sort of appreciate the logic with which they're operating culturally. For example, notions of time. If I laid out a series of pictures on this table of an individual you don't know, taken at different moments in that person's life, and said, George, tell me the story about this guy. I will bet you anything. You will tell it to me chronologically. Ooh, there he was when he was a little kid. Oh my God, is that a '57 Chevy in the background, and so on. Arabs won't generally do this. If, again, and I don't mean to stereotype, but generalize here. What they'll start saying is, oh, look at him with this group of people, and then with this group of people, and that group of people. It's as if the sets of connections that you possess, rather than their chronological unfolding, is what tells you about a person.
I appreciate that. And in fact, we're going to talk about portraiture and what it reveals and doesn't reveal in these two very different cultures. But sticking with Omar for at least one more question, Larry, and Omar might not be the best representative, to tell you the truth, to talk about the kinds of things I'm going to bring in.
Some of my neighbors would agree with you.
Because I was a little suspicious about his sincerity and what he was doing. But our notions of law and truth also somewhat differently approached in these two cultures.
Truth is an interesting example. Think of the Arab marketplace, the bazaar, where hawking and haggling are rampant, where prices are not fixed, where everything is bargainable. And imagine, and not just metaphorically, that all of your social relationships can be bargained out as well. And again, the sort of running imbalance of webs of indebtedness. Then, to make a statement for us, like, how much is that watch worth? $1, $1 million, it doesn't have any truth value until something more happens. We agree on the price. We can look it up in a list of prices, something we both agree on. Well, I think, generally speaking, in the Arab world, one can make statements about relationship. We're friends, we're cousins, we're brothers, we're buddies, whatever it might be. It's like a price in the marketplace. It doesn't connect yet with truth. It's a bare utterance, and you see what the market will bear. But then there are very definite ways in which it comes into the realm of the true. You may take an oath. You may engage in an action that relies on that statement. You make it public to people that we have this kind of relationship, and other people organize their relationships accordingly. Then truth attaches, and truth and lying become extremely important. But there's a tremendous freedom, and they need to feel that freedom to negotiate and to rise and fall. Very often they'll say, you know, a man can be a poor man one day, a vizier of the king the next, and hanged in the public market on the third day.
Repeatedly, Larry, you use a word, and I think it's very important for us to understand it, of negotiation. That in Arab and Middle Eastern, perhaps Islamic culture, this whole notion of negotiating the situation is of paramount importance.
And indeed, in Islam, if I dare speak for it in a sense, the idea is very central, that God endowed human beings with reason to build dependencies and to overcome the situations in which they find themselves. There was a debate early on in Islam as to what the theologically correct game for us new Muslim types to play would be. And there was a game of dice called Nar. And people said, that's great because we're like dice in the hands of Allah. We don't know our fate, but He does. No, 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 said the proponents of chess. God endowed you with reason to overcome your situation, to better that of you and your dependents. And Nar was declared a heretical game, and chess became the theologically correct game.
Isn't that interesting?
And it's revealing in this sense. For an anthropologist, you're always looking at the connections among multiple domains of the culture. So the idea of truth, the idea of the unfractionated self, the idea of a great game. You know, I have friends who play chess, I don't. And I will say to them, don't you guys get tired of this? I mean, why don't you add some new pieces and a couple of yellow blocks? And they're horrified. To them, the game is infinitely variable. Well, the, quote, game of negotiating relationships in the Arab world in particular is one that's infinitely alluring, and you don't have to go changing the pieces. Now, that doesn't mean it's stagnant any more than chess is. We remember the great innovative plays of recent people. We may even remember the great innovative way in which a Nasser or a Saddam Hussein put the pieces together and built it. And frankly, if you play by the mechanisms through which you form these dependencies, you are legitimate, even though you may not be particularly liked. And the next guy is always a challenge because he too gains legitimacy by engaging in the regularized process of building this constellation of indebtedness.
Right. I want to build on this very, very intriguing point that you just made, Larry, by actually shifting now to another story in another place and going from our shores to Morocco. On another occasion, I think you're involved, a trip this time, a journey. Did you take with, I think, 4 or 5 other individuals? And I think you are driving from one place to another where there's going to be hopefully some resolution of a legal dispute within a family. But the journey, and I think you make the point here that everyone who loves fiction knows very well, themes develop as people tell stories as they journey. And among this very interesting little group of men, there is a theme that seems to be building, and let me quote one of them, or quote you perhaps in your characterization of it. And it is this, and it goes along with the negotiation that you talked about. Quote, when people deal with each other face to face, they find a way to get along. Now expand on that, because it seems to me we're talking here about maybe the positive aspect of what the Omar story first told us. I mean, the negotiations can build these relationships.
Yeah, and if I can generalize, the Arab concept of the person is this attribution of a bunch of traits and connections to other people that cohere in one individual. And as they cohere, you need to know lots about other people's connections. As we were traveling around with a friend who had a legal problem, what people would constantly say then, as they do so often, is, in effect, people are not just one feature or another, nor are they held to that feature. In fact, if you can develop through your reasoning abilities, you cannot simply transcend the category, but you can add to it in ways that may effectively transcend it. And it's that incredible sense of freedom for them. You must be able to move to effect in the world and to forge these kinds of ties that is really very crucial for them. The flip side of it is when there's chaos. And there's a very definite term for that.
Fitna.
Yes.
The word fitna.
And it's an alluring term too, because it doesn't just mean chaos, it means captivating as well. Why? Because you can reshuffle the deck at certain moments, which is perhaps what was happening at the time of all the, quote, looting and anarchy in Iraq, which had a very definite form to it. It's not merely everybody doing anything against anybody else, but it's also the great fear. And is very current in the Quran and in common thought. That it's, again, like pulling that plug on relationships. I have no predictability about how you may act in other circumstances if I don't know who you owe what to whom.
Throughout what you have written, at least which I've been privileged to read, there is this fear within Islamic Arab culture of social chaos breaking out, of fitna occurring. But let's suppose, and as a result of discussions like the one on the journey in Morocco, that it doesn't go in the direction of fitna, but it does go in the more positive outcomes of this kind of creativity. And here you use a very interesting term, and it may result the optimal kind of outcome, and that is circles of benevolence?
Beneficence.
Beneficence.
Yes,
now,
it's the best translation I can give to the
and so
Arabic term.
This would be the better?
It is, and it comes about by people, as you say, interacting directly with one another, being free to move to effect in the world, not being bound into any category. There's a wonderful linguistic usage in Arabic, which someone has characterized as a trajetio ad absurdum. It's not a reduction through the absurd to show you something, but a transcendence of it. So you will say, even a woman who is learned is better than a man who is not. Well, generally it may be thought that women are more consumed by their passions and less by their reason, but even a woman may transcend this. You find this now in great inventiveness in the courts of law, both in Morocco and, for example, in Iran, where they've developed quite independently a notion of the best interests of the child for child custody, rather than the older strict regime of a child of a certain age goes to the mother and otherwise to the father. Because now many women are educated. They may even have more money, even a woman. Now, if that's
so this can lend itself to social progress in that sense.
In many respects, it's an interesting feature that no category shall be regarded, as it were, as binding you in. That they really do not seem to believe in or like.
In all that we've talked about, and again, set in the context of the journey in Morocco, as the narratives and the stories develop and go on, I was struck by another thing, though, Larry, that, to put it bluntly, this all occurs outside of formal government, or seems to be independent of the political structure.
In fact, you can go a step further. In every relationship, there's reciprocity. There's an expectation that if I do something, I should be able to call it back in some other way at a later time. There really isn't a very good word in Arabic for a, quote, favor. In North Africa, they borrowed the French or the Spanish favor. Something is just a favor, it's without expectation, but common sense says there always would be. So the idea, in part, is to build up these in debts so that you can call things forth at various other times. Part of the notion of beneficence is to be built into some constantly changing web of indebtedness with all sorts and kinds of different people, and that will define who you are. If you go into a court of law, the first thing they will ask is, who are you? Who are you connected to? Who do you know? And we may say, wait a minute, that's irrelevant. Or the past things you did are irrelevant. And they say, how will I know who you are if I don't know what you did in the past? Like those pictures on the table, I need to see you in all those different contexts of relationship.
Well, let's talk about another aspect of that and pick up on the court of law idea here, Larry. One of the individuals, in fact, one of the more colorful individuals on your journey is a judge.
Yes.
Who is, I think, inebriated most of the time. He's there not to render judgment, but to, I think, give advice. But I wonder about the advice. But in any event, he, in his person, represents the ugly aspect of corruption.
Yes.
So I guess the question to you, Larry, is how does corruption, and that is a fact of life in many of the societies we're talking about, figure in and affect what we're talking about here?
I do believe that particular judge was unusual, both for his inebriation and his corruption.
I'm glad to hear that.
But perhaps I can tell you a very quick story about how once in the mountains of Morocco, a group of men after lunch asked me, is there corruption in America? And I said, yes. And they said, give me an example. And I mentioned Watergate. And they said, no, that's just politics. And I mentioned a kickback arrangement. And he said, no, that's just buying and selling. And I mentioned nepotism. And they said, no, that's just family solidarity. And while I was sitting there trying to think of an example that would save the honor of my country for being every bit as corrupt as anybody else's, the one man looked at the others and he said, you see why America is so strong? They have no corruption. So of course I had to ask them, what is corruption? And my way of framing their answer, and it's one you hear right around the Middle East, is corruption is the failure to share with those with whom you have formed these bonds of dependence whatever largesse comes your way. And the idiom is, you eat it and you don't share it with the other people. Now, that's a very different notion of corruption because it goes to the heart of this non-governmentally based building of reciprocal relationships. In a sense, the state is unreciprocity incarnate. You don't have a reciprocal relationship. You can't indebt the government. You may at moments try. It was quite wonderful after the King of Morocco died. That's not why it was wonderful. People were lined up at post offices all over Morocco sending messages to the new king and asking something of him. But the irony was they sent it return receipt requested. They wanted some proof that he would be obliged to them now. Now, this is all part of a style of forging these bonds of reciprocity. But with the state, reciprocity is not really possible. And that leads to this sense of corruption. And I honestly believe, certainly in North Africa and many other parts of the Arab world, corruption of this sort is very recent. It's very petty now. And it is pervasive, and it really is truly destructive.
I wonder, that's
and destructive, if I say so, George, of people's sense of their own worth and of their ability to fashion these ties with people and thus be identified as a proper person.
That's very helpful, Larry. And you know, actually, as I listened to it, I also began to think, speaking of things that are recent, of the recent controversy between the Islamic world and many in the West concerning the very terrible and derogatory depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. And I'm wondering, Larry, because context seems to be so important in what you're saying, has there been a failure in the West to appreciate the context in which Muhammad is seen?
I think that's true.
Islam, which is
Yes, I think it's true. The Danish cartoons came in a context, for example, in Denmark when there were aggravating circumstances between the Muslim community and the Danes. It came in a context, too, in which the cartoons themselves, whatever offensiveness they may have possessed, were coupled, by the way, with 3 totally fabricated cartoons that were really egregious, showing the prophet engaged in bestiality and other things. And those got around in various places and further inflamed things. I do think that it's very strongly felt by many Muslims, not so much that one cannot ever portray human beings, even the prophet. In fact, there were pictures of him early in Islam, but that it's the mode in which they may be presented that can be offensive. And it is a bit of a conundrum because in the West, the use of irony and sarcasm and cartoon caricatures, which Arabs in particular and Persians are readily using in political domains, has a very different meaning when it seems to be attacking a figure of religious value.
Exactly. So in the Middle East, this was not so much at all perhaps an issue of press freedom, but rather one of blasphemy?
Yes, and of disrespect.
Disrespect.
You know, when I read with my students at Princeton portions of Salman Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses, it makes all the difference in the world if I have a Muslim student in the class, as I did the last time, who said, First Amendment, absolutely, but let me tell you why it hurts. And you only have to imagine some of the ways in which Christ can be portrayed, in which your own religious beliefs can be portrayed that can be hurtful. Muhammad occupies a very unusual position, not just because he's not really a sacred figure, he's a prophet by all means, but he was very human and he was regarded as flawed in many respects. After all, he was fooled by the Satanic Verses at one point. But as somebody who is so central to the way in which you try to fashion yourself, that it becomes an attack on him as a master teacher about proper ways to act, as well as the conveyor of a message from God.
You're attacking the very heart of the religion.
Yes, and an attack, notice too, I think, that also attacks relationships. You see,
yes, of course.
It is contributory to fitna. If people can say these kinds of things of one another, even their most sacred figures, even the other guy's honored prophet, then what predictability is there about the civility of relationship between any people? To Muslims, to Arabs at least, if you ask what's the opposite of freedom, what's the opposite of tyranny, they won't usually say freedom. What they'll say the opposite of tyranny is chaos, fitna, social disorder. Because then it's impossible for people to have any degree of connectedness to one another and any degree of respect for one another. And I believe that they see this in no small part as an attack on orderliness in that sense.
That's extremely helpful, Larry. I mean, I really think that is going to have us all, myself and those watching, thinking for a long time.
You have to look at things for the meaning they hold for the people themselves. And meaning means connectedness. How one domain is connected to another so that the world appears to be both orderly and almost natural.
Because meaning has that importance, that connectedness has that importance in the culture that we're talking about. And I know also, Larry, that you are now and have been for some time concerned with democracy and the forging of democracy in the Middle East. I'd love for you to give us a sense of what you think is important in the kinds of forms of democracy that may be emerging as meaningful in that region of the world.
Certainly there's no incompatibility between Islam, say, and democracy, and certainly democracy is not limited to any singular form. But if I were being very Wilsonian and looking for, several freedoms that I think most Arabs and probably Iranians would feel is necessary to the form of democracy that they're looking at, it would have to include this ability to move freely and forge ties wherever they prove most effective. It would have to include a feeling that you could be ruled by your own confessional faith for purposes of matters of personal status. Now, we have a singular state law for, say, family law. But when you have Shiite and Sunni, when you have a multiplicity, they would want to be ruled by that, though perhaps with an opt-out clause in which you could use a state statute. They would also, I think, want very much to feel that the state's preeminent role is to prevent this kind of social chaos, and yes, they may put greater value on orderliness than certain forms of expression, but they would regard that as democratic, and especially the elimination of this rampant, low-level corruption.
Larry Rosen, I want to thank you very, very much. I mean, it's been absolutely a magnificent experience to talk to you about this.
Thank you so much, George.
And literally to take it from our shores to the region of the origin of the culture, and to show how not just issues and problems exist, but how we can overcome them if we're wise enough to understand them.
We're now all connected whether we know it or not.
Thank you, Larry Rosen.
Thank you.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching. And Larry Rosen, thank you. That was a tour de force. Well done, man.